Sometimes life can strip away everything you thought defined you. Sometimes a single moment can remind you who you really are. Behind a restaurant in Seoul, David Mercer digs through trash for his next meal. The well-dressed staff see a homeless man. But David was once one of the world's most respected interpreters. He spoke for presidents and prime ministers. Now he speaks to no one, until today. When CEO Riku Tanaka steps out of the restaurant, David does something he hasn't done in years. He speaks up, in perfect Japanese. What David knows could save Riku's company or destroy it completely. What happens when two men who have lost everything find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gleaming towers of Seoul's financial district cast long shadows across the narrow alleyways where David Mercer had learned to survive. From the 42nd floor of the Tanaka Corporation building, those same shadows looked like elegant, geometric patterns on an urban canvas. Riku Tanaka pressed his palm against the cool glass of his corner office window, watching the ant-like movement of people below. At 46, he carried the weight of 3 generations of family business on his shoulders. Along with the expectations of 12,000 employees worldwide, his personal life had become equally isolated. His wife, Keiko, maintained the social obligations expected of a corporate executive spouse, but their relationship had grown distant and formal. She attended company events and family gatherings, but their private conversations had become limited to logistics and scheduling rather than genuine intimacy or shared drinks. His 2 teenage children respected him, but seemed to find him more dutiful than inspiring, more reliable than engaging. The loneliness of leadership had intensified since his father's death. Board meetings felt like performance evaluations rather than collaborative strategy sessions. Employee interactions carried undertones of judgment and comparison to his father's more charismatic leadership style. Even his closest advisors seemed to be waiting for him to either prove himself worthy of his inherited position or reveal himself as the disappointment they secretly suspected he might be. The leaked intelligence represented more than a business threat. It was a personal failure that confirmed his deepest insecurities about his own competence. If he couldn't protect the company's most basic assets, if he couldn't identify and address betrayal within his own organization, how could he justify his position as leader of a multinational corporation? How could he honor his father's legacy while failing in such fundamental responsibilities? David's journey to Seoul had been driven by similar questions about purpose and identity, though his path had been far more circuitous and destructive. After the accident that claimed his family, he had disappeared from his Washington apartment without notice, abandoning his career, his responsibilities, and his identity with the same completeness that grief had emptied his life of meaning. The first year had been spent in a haze of alcohol and guilt, moving between cities without direction or purpose. He had worked temporary jobs when his money ran low, using false names and paying cash for everything to avoid leaving traces that might connect him to his former life. The languages that had once been his professional advantage became tools. For invisibility, he could blend into immigrant communities, find work that didn't require documentation, survive in places where his past didn't matter because no one expected homeless people to have complicated histories. Korea had been a random destination, chosen because he had found a discarded airline ticket in a bus station and decided that moving across an ocean might somehow create enough distance from his memories to make survival bearable. He had been wrong about that, but by the time he realized that geography couldn't cure grief, he had already established routines and survival strategies that made staying easier than leaving. The streets of Seoul had taught him lessons that 15 years of diplomatic service had never covered. How to find food without money, how to stay warm without shelter, how to remain safe without status or protection. More importantly, He had learned how to become functionally invisible to the professional class he had once belonged to, how to observe and understand complex situations while remaining completely unnoticed by the people who would have considered him irrelevant even if they had noticed his presence. His linguistic abilities had proven surprisingly valuable for survival. Korea's international business community conducted conversations in multiple languages, often switching between Korean, Japanese, English, and Chinese within the same discussion. Business executives assumed that homeless people couldn't understand their conversations, so they discussed sensitive matters with complete openness while David sat nearby, appearing to sleep or search through garbage but actually absorbing detailed intelligence about corporate strategies, market conditions, and competitive relationships. Over 8 years, he had developed comprehensive knowledge of Seoul's business ecosystem. He understood which companies were thriving and which were struggling, which executives were competent and which were failing, which industries were growing and which were declining. The information had no practical value for his survival, but maintaining his analytical skills had become a form of mental exercise that kept him connected to his former identity as a professional interpreter and strategic analyst. The decision to approach Riku had been spontaneous rather than calculated. David had been observing the patterns of betrayal within Tanaka Corporation for months, recognizing the sophisticated coordination that suggested systematic conspiracy rather than opportunistic theft. When he saw Riku emerge from the restaurant, looking defeated and isolated, something in the younger man's posture had reminded David of his own struggles with inherited responsibility and overwhelming pressure. Speaking up had required overcoming 8 years of carefully maintained silence and invisibility. David had trained himself to observe without participating, to understand without engaging, to survive without mattering to anyone else's life or decisions. Breaking that protective isolation to warn a stranger about corporate espionage represented the most significant risk he had taken since losing his family, not physical risk, but psychological risk of caring about something beyond his own daily survival. The torn business card in his pocket had become both talisman and torment during his years on the street. Sometimes he would take it out and study the faded text, trying to remember what it had felt like to have professional identity and social relevance. Other times he would resolve to throw it away, to abandon the last connection to a life that had ended with such catastrophic completeness. But he never quite managed to discard it, perhaps because it represented the possibility that competence and worth might survive even when everything else had been lost. Now, facing the possibility of using his skills to help someone else navigate complex challenges, David felt both hope and terror. Hope that his capabilities might still have value, that his insights might contribute to something meaningful. Terror that attempting to re-engage with the professional world might expose how completely he had been broken by loss, how thoroughly his confidence had been destroyed by guilt and grief. The conversation with Riku in the alley had lasted only minutes, but it had represented the most significant human connection David had experienced in years. Not just the exchange of information, but the moment of mutual recognition between two men struggling with different versions of inherited responsibility and personal inadequacy. Riku's willingness to listen, to consider intelligence from such an unlikely source, suggested qualities of leadership and wisdom that went beyond the conventional corporate executive profile. Father's vintage Seiko watch caught the morning light as Riku adjusted his cufflinks. The timepiece had been passed down from his grandfather, who built the company from nothing after the war, to his father, who expanded it across Asia, and now to him, the keeper of a legacy he sometimes felt unworthy to inherit. The watch's steady tick had become a metronome for his anxiety, marking time until the next crisis, the next difficult decision, the next disappointment he might bring to the family name. "Sir, the board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Yuki, his assistant, appeared in the doorway with her usual efficiency. She had worked for his father before him, one of the few constants in his increasingly turbulent world. "Thank you. Any word from Kim about those leaked design specifications?" "Nothing concrete yet, but he's concerned. The information that reached our competitors was too detailed, too recent. It had to come from someone with high-level access." Riku nodded grimly. For months, proprietary information had been finding its way to rival companies. Product launches that should have given them market advantages became races to second place. Trade secrets that took years to develop appeared in competitor presentations within weeks. Someone inside Tanaka Corporation was betraying everything his family had built. 15 miles away, in an alley behind the upscale Sakura Fusion restaurant, David Mercer folded the torn remnants of his former business card back into his coat pocket. The cardstock had gone soft from rain and time, the embossed letters barely visible. David R. Mercer, Senior Diplomatic Interpreter. Once, that small piece of paper had opened doors to conference rooms where world leaders shaped history. Now it served as nothing more than a reminder of how far he'd fallen. The morning ritual never changed. David would wait until the restaurant staff finished their prep work and began service, before approaching the dumpster behind the building. Korean fusion cuisine meant decent scraps rice that hadn't been touched. Vegetables still fresh enough to eat. Occasionally, even meat that someone had ordered, but barely consumed. The key was timing and invisibility. Stay quiet, move quickly, disappear before anyone noticed. He had chosen this particular alley, not for the food quality, but for something far more practical. It sat at the intersection of 3 major business districts, making it an ideal listening post. During his decade on the streets, David had discovered that homeless people became functionally invisible to the professional class. Businessmen would conduct sensitive conversations within earshot of someone they assumed couldn't understand, or didn't matter. Over the years, David had learned more about Seoul's corporate intrigues than most. Financial journalists thought his linguistic gifts had not dulled despite his circumstances. 7 languages had been his specialty during his diplomatic career: Korean, Japanese, Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, Spanish, and English, with conversational ability in several others. The human brain was remarkable in its capacity to retain complex language patterns, even when survival became the only priority. David often found himself unconsciously translating overheard conversations, a mental exercise that kept his mind sharp during the long, empty hours. The fall had begun 8 years ago with a single moment of inattention. David had been interpreting for a high-stakes peace negotiation in Geneva when his phone buzzed with a text from his wife Sarah. Emma's soccer game moved to 4 p.m., don't forget. Their 8-year-old daughter had been so excited about the tournament. David had glanced at his phone for barely 3 seconds. But those seconds came during a crucial exchange about territorial boundaries. He misinterpreted a key phrase from the Russian delegate, suggesting flexibility where none existed. The talks collapsed. 6 months later, violence erupted in the disputed region. The guilt had eaten at him slowly, like acid on metal. Sarah tried to convince him it wasn't his fault. That complex international situations didn't hinge on single moments, but David knew better. Language was precision. Interpretation was sacred trust. He had failed at the most fundamental level of his profession. The drinking started as a way to sleep, then became a way to function, then became the only thing that mattered more than the crushing weight of his failure. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. Sarah was driving Emma to school when a drunk driver ran a red light. David had been passed out in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and resignation letters he'd written but never sent. He woke up to a phone call that shattered what remained of his world. The funeral was a blur of faces and condolences and speeches about how precious life was and how quickly it could be taken away. David heard none of it. He was already gone, already disappearing into the bottle and the guilt, and the crushing certainty that he had lost the only things that had ever truly mattered. Riku's path to isolation had been entirely different but no less complete. Born into privilege and expectation, he had spent his entire adult life trying to measure up to his father's legend. Hiroshi Tanaka had been a visionary, the kind of leader who could see market trends years before they materialized, who inspired loyalty through genuine care for his employees, who never compromised his principles, even when it cost him profits. Riku possessed his father's intelligence and work ethic, but he lacked the intuitive leadership that had made Hiroshi beloved by everyone who worked for him. The pressure had intensified after his father's unexpected death 3 years earlier. Heart attack at 62, found collapsed in the same office on a Sunday afternoon, still working on strategies to expand their renewable energy division. The board had expected Riku to seamlessly step into his father's role, to continue the steady growth and innovation that had defined the company for decades. Instead, they'd gotten a cautious, analytical leader who second-guessed every decision and sought consensus instead of providing vision. His personal life had become equally isolated. His wife, Keiko, maintained the social obligations expected of a corporate executive spouse, but their relationship had grown distant and formal. She attended company events and family gatherings, but their private conversations had become limited to logistics and scheduling rather than genuine intimacy or shared dreams. His 2 teenage children respected him, but seemed to find him more dutiful than inspiring, more reliable than engaging. The confrontation began with the clatter of an overturned trash can and the sharp voices of restaurant staff shouting in Korean. Riku had stepped out of Sakura Fusion's back entrance to take a private phone call about the morning's board meeting when he saw 3 young servers surrounding a figure hunched over the dumpster. "Hey, get away from there." The head server, a thin man with nervous energy, waved his arms dramatically. "We've told you before, no digging through our garbage." The homeless man straightened slowly, turning to face his accusers with a dignity that seemed incongruous with his appearance. His clothes were layered and worn, his hair unkempt, his face weathered by years of outdoor living. But his posture was straight, his movements controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made everyone pause. "Tanaka-san," he said in perfect formal Japanese, looking directly at Riku, "I apologize for the disturbance. I believe we may have met before, though under quite different circumstances." Riku's phone nearly slipped from his hand. The homeless man had not only recognized him, but had addressed him with proper honorifics in flawless Japanese, not the basic conversational Japanese that some foreigners manage to learn, but the nuanced, respectful dialect used in high-level business meetings. The servers fell silent, uncertain how to proceed. Their obvious vagrant was speaking to their important customer as an equal, and something in the dynamic had shifted in a way none of them understood. "I'm sorry," Riku said carefully in Japanese, "but I don't believe we've been introduced." "David Mercer," the man replied, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to formal introductions. "I had the honor of working the diplomatic conference where your father delivered his keynote on sustainable international business practices. Tokyo, 2018. You were seated in the front row, taking notes on everything he said." The memory hit Riku like a physical blow. His father's last major international speech, delivered just months before his death. Riku had indeed been there, had indeed taken detailed notes, trying to absorb every lesson his father might offer about leadership and vision. The conference had featured interpreters from multiple languages, but he couldn't possibly remember. You translated his speech into English and Russian simultaneously, David continued. When the Russian energy minister asked about carbon offset partnerships, you provided cultural context that wasn't in the original text, but was essential for understanding your father's position. Your father was impressed. He mentioned afterward that the interpreter understood not just the words, but the intention behind them. Riku stared at this man, who looked like he hadn't seen the inside of a building in years, yet spoke with the precise recall of a professional diplomat. "That was you. That was me." David's smile was sad but genuine. "I've changed somewhat since then." The servers had backed away, sensing this conversation was beyond their authority to interrupt. Riku found himself stepping closer, studying David's face for traces of the polished professional he claimed to have been. "What happened to you?" The question came out more bluntly than Riku intended. "Life," David said simply. "The same thing that's happening to you, I suspect, though perhaps more, gradually." "What do you mean?" David glanced around the alley, ensuring they weren't overheard. "Your company is bleeding information to competitors. Someone with high-level access is selling your trade secrets. Within 6 months, if the leaks continue at their current rate, Tanaka Corporation will lose its competitive advantage in 3 major markets." Riku felt the blood drain from his face. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I've been listening." David's voice dropped to just above a whisper. "For 3 years, I've watched and heard things that would surprise you. Corporate executives. Think homeless people of furniture invisible, irrelevant. They discuss sensitive matters right in front of us as if we don't exist. I know about your supply chain vulnerabilities in Southeast Asia. I know about the board's discussion of replacing you with someone more dynamic. I know about the leak, because I've heard multiple conversations about it from people who assume I can't understand Korean or Japanese, or that I don't matter enough to be a security risk." The world seemed to tilt around Riku. This vagrant, this man eating from garbage cans, possessed information that his own security team had been unable to gather. "Why are you telling me this?" David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Because I know what it's like to watch something you care about disappear because of betrayal. Because your father was a good man who treated people with dignity, and his son deserves to know the truth. And because," he paused, vulnerability creeping into his voice, "because speaking up is something I haven't done in a very long time. I thought perhaps it was time to try again." Riku's mind raced through the implications. If David was telling the truth about his identity and his information, he represented an intelligence asset unlike anything Riku had ever encountered. Someone with access to street-level corporate intelligence, with the linguistic skills to understand conversations in multiple languages, and with the invisibility that came with his social status. But trusting a homeless stranger with sensitive corporate matters went against every instinct he developed as a business leader. "You're asking me to believe that a man living on the streets has better intelligence about my company than my own security department." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," David replied. "I'm offering you information. What you do with it is your choice. But I would suggest you look closely at your recent product development meetings. Someone has been photographing documents. The photos are being transmitted to external parties through encrypted messaging applications. You'll find the evidence if you know what to look for." David began to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Your father used to say that the most valuable insights often come from the most unexpected sources." He was talking about market research at the time, but the principle applies more broadly. "Wait." Riku's voice carried more urgency than he intended. "If what you're saying is true, if you really do know who's responsible, I have suspicions, strong ones. But suspicion isn't proof. An accusation without evidence destroys innocent people along with the guilty. Trust me, I understand the consequences of speaking carelessly." The weight of David's words settled over Riku like a heavy coat. Here was a man who had lost everything, offering help to someone who still had something left to lose. The irony wasn't lost on him that his potential salvation might come from someone society had written off as worthless. How do I know you're really who you claim to be? David reached into his coat and withdrew the torn business card, handing it to Riku. The embossed text was barely legible, but the name and title were clear enough. Check the conference records from 2018. Cross-reference the interpreter. Assignments with diplomatic archives. The verification will take you about an hour if you're thorough. Riku studied the damaged card, noting the quality of the original. Printing, the professional design, the subtle details that would be difficult to fake. Assuming I verify your identity and your information proves accurate, what would you want in return? Nothing you can give me, David said quietly. I'm not looking for money or position or rehabilitation. I just want to do something useful before I disappear entirely. Consider it a final professional courtesy. The servers had returned to the restaurant, leaving the two men alone in the alley. Riku looked at this unexpected figure, part homeless vagrant, part intelligence asset, part ghost from his father's past, and realized he was facing a decision that would define his leadership more than any board meeting or quarterly report ever could. If I decide to trust you, Riku said slowly, how would we proceed? David's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been hope. Very carefully and completely in secret. The person you're looking for is close to you, closer than you want to believe. The verification took Riku exactly 57 minutes. Back in his office, he cross-referenced diplomatic records with conference attendance lists, then matched those against interpreter assignments from the 2018 Tokyo International Business Summit. David Robert Mercer, senior diplomatic interpreter, had indeed worked the event. His credentials were impeccable. Advanced degrees in linguistics from Georgetown University, 15 years of experience with the State Department, security clearances that had allowed him to work with heads of state. The records showed a stellar career that ended abruptly in 2016 with a simple notation: resigned for personal reasons. No disciplinary actions, no performance issues. Just a sudden departure from a profession he had clearly mastered. The absence of explanation made David's current circumstances even more mysterious and tragic. Riku had spent the afternoon implementing David's suggestion about photograph documents. A discreet review of recent product development meetings revealed something that chilled him. Several attendees had been positioning their phones to capture specific documents on the conference table. The behavior looked casual, like people checking messages, but when Riku examined the angles and timing, the pattern became unmistakable. 3 people had consistently positioned their devices to photograph sensitive materials. 3 people he trusted. 3 people who now represented potential betrayals that cut deeper than simple corporate espionage. That evening, Riku returned to the alley behind Sakura Fusion. David was there, as if he had anticipated the meeting, sitting on an overturned milk crate and reading a water-stained paperback novel by the dim light of a street lamp. The book was in Russian, Riku noted, another confirmation of David's linguistic abilities. Dostoevsky, David said without looking up. Crime and Punishment. I found it in a bus station 3 months ago. It seemed appropriately ironic. Your credentials check out, Riku said, settling onto a nearby crate with careful attention to his expensive suit. Everything you told me about the conference, about my father, it's all accurate. I'm not surprised. I don't lie about things. That can be verified. There's no point. I found the photography pattern you mentioned. 3 potential suspects, all with high-level access, all with financial pressures that might motivate betrayal. David closed the book and gave Riku his full attention. Financial pressures are rarely the primary motivation for corporate espionage. Usually, it's personal grievance mixed with opportunity. Someone who feels undervalued or passed over. Someone who believes they deserve more recognition or compensation than they've received. The money is often secondary to the satisfaction of proving their worth to people who underestimated them. The observation struck Riku as both insightful and troubling. You seem to understand betrayal quite well. I understand failure, David corrected. Betrayal is often what happens when people can't accept responsibility for their own failures. They need to blame someone else, to hurt someone else, to prove that their failures weren't really their fault at all. David withdrew a small notebook. From his coat pocket, not the pristine journal of a businessman, but pages held together with tape and filled with careful handwriting in multiple languages. I've been documenting conversations I've overheard for several years now. Initially, it was just mental exercise, a way to stay sharp, but patterns emerged. Corporate intelligence that someone in your field might find valuable. He flipped through pages covered in dense notes names, dates, conversation fragments, analysis written in margins. The handwriting was precise despite the poor materials, the observations detailed and professionally structured. This wasn't the random scribbling of a homeless person, but the systematic intelligence gathering of a trained professional who had maintained his skills despite his circumstances. Park Min-jun from your research and development department, David said, pointing to a series of entries. He's been meeting regularly with representatives from Hyundai Energy Solutions. The meetings happen at a coffee shop near Hongik University. Always on Tuesday afternoons, always cash transactions for the coffee. Park believes his contributions to your renewable energy patents haven't been properly acknowledged. He mentioned feeling invisible despite his technical expertise. Riku felt his stomach drop. Park was a brilliant engineer, one of the original developers of their revolutionary solar panel efficiency technology. He had indeed been passed over for promotion several times, not due to lack of competence, but because his presentation skills were poor and his interpersonal relationships were limited. A classic case of technical genius without the political acumen to advance in a corporate environment. How do you know all this? Park lives in a small apartment near my usual territory. He talks to himself when he's angry, often in technical language that he assumes no one around him can understand. He's been practicing conversations with imaginary supervisors, working through his grievances. Last month, he started practicing conversations with imaginary competitors. The content of those imaginary conversations became quite specific and quite damaging to your company. David turned to another section of his notes. Your assistant, Yuki, has been under tremendous pressure from medical bills for her mother's cancer treatment. The treatments are experimental and not covered by insurance. She's been working extra hours to access files that might be valuable to competitors, then arranging anonymous sales through cryptocurrency transactions. She believes you don't pay her enough to handle both her job responsibilities and her family obligations. The revelation about Yuki hit Riku harder than the information about Park. She had been his father's assistant first, had worked for the company for over a decade, had seemed unquestionably loyal. But Riku realized he had never asked about her personal life, had never inquired about her family or her financial pressures. He had simply assumed her loyalty was unconditional and her salary was adequate. The third suspect is more complicated, David continued, his voice growing more cautious. Kim Sung-ho from your legal department has been photographing documents, but I don't believe he's selling information to competitors. His photography seems focused on compliance issues and internal communications. I suspect he's building a case for a lawsuit against the company, possibly related to workplace discrimination or unfair labor practices. Riku had hired Kim 2 years earlier based on stellar recommendations and impressive credentials. He was methodical, thorough, and had successfully protected the company from several potential legal challenges. But he was also ambitious and had made it clear he expected rapid advancement within the organization. So I have 3 betrayals with 3 completely different motivations, Riku said, the weight of leadership feeling heavier than ever. A brilliant engineer who feels unrecognized, a loyal assistant struggling with family crisis, and an ambitious lawyer building a case against us. Each one represents a failure of leadership, David said, gently but directly. Not necessarily your failure, but systemic organizational failures that created conditions where betrayal felt justified or necessary. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Riku had been so focused on maintaining the company's financial performance and market position that he had neglected the human elements that his father had prioritized. His father would have known about Yuki's family situation. His father would have found ways to recognize Park's contributions. His father would have managed Kim's expectations more effectively. You're saying this is my fault. I'm saying that leadership involves understanding the people you depend on. Your father understood that. He made mistakes, but he never made the mistake of treating his employees as interchangeable resources. People who feel valued rarely betray the organizations they work for. David's words carried the weight of experience and regret. I made similar mistakes in my own career. I focused on technical excellence and professional achievement while neglecting the relationships that actually mattered. When crisis came, I had no foundation of trust or support to sustain me. I had built a career, but not a community. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in contemplation of their respective failures. Around them, the city continued its relentless pace traffic, pedestrians, the constant hum of urban life, but in their small alley, time felt suspended. If your analysis is correct, Riku finally said, how do we proceed? I can't simply accuse 3 people based on observations from. He paused, uncertain how to phrase it diplomatically. But based on observations from a homeless vagrant, David finished. I understand the problem. My intelligence is valuable, but my credibility is non-existent. Any direct action based on my information would destroy innocent people along with the guilty and would likely expose my involvement, which would compromise whatever usefulness I might have in the future. David's street map of Seoul had been developing for nearly a decade, marked not with tourist attractions or commercial districts, but with survival routes, safe sleeping spots, and strategic observation points. He showed Riku the careful notations he had made, which alleys provided the best acoustics for overhearing conversations, which buildings had security cameras that might record sensitive meetings, which restaurants discarded food at predictable times. The city becomes different when you live in it rather than on top of it, David explained, tracing routes with his finger across the hand-drawn map. Business people move in patterns. They have favorite coffee shops, preferred walking routes, regular meeting spots they think are private. When you're invisible, you can map those patterns with remarkable precision. Riku studied the map, impressed by its detail and accuracy. David had noted the locations of corporate headquarters, marked the apartment buildings where key executives lived, identified the restaurants and bars where important deals were negotiated after hours. It was intelligence gathering at a level that would have impressed professional security consultants. This is extraordinary work, Riku said. You've essentially created a comprehensive surveillance map of Seoul's business district. Survival required understanding my environment completely. The byproduct happened to be useful for other purposes. David folded the map carefully and returned it to his coat. But maps are only valuable if you know how to read them and act on the information they provide. Over the following week, they began meeting regularly in the alley behind Sakura Fusion. Riku would arrive after his evening meetings, usually carrying food from the restaurant that he would share with David. The meals became opportunities for David to share observations from his day, while Riku provided context about corporate politics and decision-making processes. The partnership was strange and unlikely, but it worked with surprising effectiveness. David's street-level intelligence complemented Riku's insider knowledge, creating a comprehensive picture of how information flowed through and around Tanaka Corporation. They began to understand not just who was betraying the company, but how. The betrayals were structured, who was coordinating the activities, and what the ultimate objectives might be. Park's technical information is being packaged with strategic intelligence that he couldn't possibly have access to, David observed during one of their evening conversations. Someone else is providing market analysis, competitive intelligence, and long-term corporate planning documents. Park is just one piece of a larger operation. Yuki has access to my calendar and communications, but she doesn't understand the technical specifications well enough to know which information would be most valuable to competitors, Riku added. Someone is directing her towards specific documents and explaining their significance, which suggests a coordinator with high-level access and comprehensive understanding of your business operations, David concluded. Someone who knows both the technical and strategic elements of your company. The realization that they were dealing with a sophisticated conspiracy rather than individual acts of betrayal changed the nature of their investigation. Simple theft of trade secrets was one thing. Systematic corporate espionage was quite another. The scope of the threat was larger than either man had initially understood. David's insights into the psychology of betrayal proved particularly valuable. People don't usually start with major acts of disloyalty, he explained. They begin with small compromises that feel justified or necessary. Someone asks for a small favor. Someone offers a small payment for innocuous information. The compromises escalate gradually until the person is completely ensnared. So Park, Yuki, and Kim might not even realize they're part of a larger conspiracy? Almost certainly not. Each probably believes their actions are isolated and relatively minor. The coordinator understands how to compartmentalize information so that individual participants can't see the full picture of what they're contributing to. Riku found himself developing genuine respect for David's analytical abilities. Despite his circumstances, the man possessed one of the sharpest strategic minds Riku had ever encountered. His insights into human motivation and organizational dynamics were sophisticated and accurate, informed by years of diplomatic experience and sharpened by the harsh realities of survival. "How did you end up here?" Riku asked during one of their meals. "I understand there was a personal tragedy, but the gap between diplomatic interpreter and homeless vagrants seems impossibly wide." David was quiet for a long time, staring at the food in front of him without eating. "Grief and guilt are powerful destroyers," he finally said. "When you lose everything that matters to you, everything else starts to feel meaningless." I stopped caring about my career, my reputation, my future. I stopped caring about myself. Once you stop caring, the descent is remarkably quick. But you kept your skills, your intelligence, your languages. Those were never conscious choices. They were just part of who I was at a fundamental level. The human brain retains complex learning, even when everything else falls apart. I couldn't stop being a linguist any more than I could stop breathing. David's explanation resonated with Riku's own experience of inheritance and identity. Just as David couldn't stop being a linguist, Riku couldn't stop being his father's son, couldn't escape the weight of family legacy and expectation. They were both defined by capabilities they had developed before they understood their consequences. "What happened to your family?" Riku asked gently. "Car accident. Drunk driver, rainy night, wrong place at the wrong time. My wife and daughter died instantly. I was supposed to be driving that day, but I was passed out drunk in my study instead. Sarah took MA's school in my place because I was too hungover to function." The pain in David's voice was raw, despite the years that had passed. "I've spent 8 years trying to decide whether I'm responsible for their deaths. If I had been sober, if I had been driving, would the accident have happened? Would I have taken a different route, left at a different time, made different decisions that would have kept them alive?" The uncertainty is worse than guilt. Guilt, at least, provides clarity about responsibility. Riku understood the weight of impossible questions. I ask myself similar things about my father's death. If I had been more involved in the business, if I had pushed him to take better care of his health, if I had been the son he deserved instead of a disappointment he was too kind to acknowledge, would he still be alive? Would he have been working alone in his office on a Sunday if I had been carrying my share of the responsibility? The questions never stop, David said, but they become part of the background noise after a while. You learn to function despite them, though you never really learn to ignore them. Their shared understanding of loss and responsibility created a bond that transcended their vastly different circumstances. Both men had been shaped by failures that continued to define them. Years later, both carried guilt that was probably undeserved but felt completely real. Both had isolated themselves as a response to pain they couldn't resolve. "Why are you helping me?" Riku asked. "You said you wanted nothing in return. But that can't be entirely true. Everyone wants something." David considered the question carefully. "I spent years believing I had nothing left to contribute, that my skills were worthless, that I was fundamentally broken. Helping you solve this problem proves to myself that I'm still capable of something useful. It's a form of self-respect that I thought I had lost permanently. And if we succeed, if we expose the conspiracy and save the company, what happens to you then?" "I disappear back into the streets, but with the knowledge that I did something meaningful before I'm completely forgotten. That's enough. It has to be enough." Riku's executive access badge had become more than a tool for building entry. It represented everything David could no longer claim about belonging in the professional world. During one of their evening meetings, David examined the badge with careful attention, noting its security features and technological sophistication. "I used to have credentials like this," David said, running his thumb over the magnetic strip. "Diplomatic facilities, international conferences, secured government buildings. There's a particular weight to carrying identification that grants you access to places where important decisions are made. When you lose that access, you lose more than just entry to buildings. You lose proof of your relevance." "The badge feels heavier lately," Riku admitted. "Every time I scan it, I'm reminded of everything I'm responsible for and everything I'm failing to protect." Their investigation had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against Tanaka Corporation. The intelligence theft was sophisticated and comprehensive, involving multiple corporate layers and extending beyond simple trade secret appropriation. Someone with intimate knowledge of the company's structure was systematically dismantling its competitive advantages while carefully avoiding detection through traditional security channels. "The coordination is too precise to be opportunistic," David observed, reviewing the patterns they had documented. "Someone is orchestrating multiple betrayals with specific objectives and clear timelines. This isn't random corporate espionage. It's a targeted attack designed to cripple your company's market, positioned before a major acquisition or hostile takeover." Riku felt the board's pressure intensifying daily. Quarterly profits were declining as competitors consistently beat them to market with suspiciously similar products. Market share was eroding in key sectors. The board members who had once deferred to his family name were now questioning his leadership openly, suggesting that perhaps the company needed more aggressive management to meet contemporary challenges. "My father built relationships with the board over decades," Riku explained during one of their conversations. "They trusted his judgment because he had earned their respect through consistent results. I inherited their tolerance, but I haven't earned their confidence. Every mistake I make confirms their suspicions that I'm not capable of filling his role." "Leadership during crisis is different from leadership during stability," David replied. "Your father had the luxury of gradual decision-making and long-term planning. You're dealing with active sabotage while trying to maintain normal operations. The fact that you haven't completely collapsed under this pressure suggests you're stronger than you realize." David's own relationship with pressure had been tested in diplomatic contexts where single words could impact international relationships. I once interpreted for peace negotiations where both sides were looking for excuses to resume hostilities. Every phrase had to be perfect, every nuance preserved, every cultural context maintained. The pressure was enormous because failure meant real consequences for real people. But pressure also created clarity about what actually mattered. What mattered to you then? Precision, truth, the responsibility to represent people's actual intentions rather than what I thought they should have said. I learned that my job wasn't to make people sound more reasonable or diplomatic than they actually were. My job was to be a transparent conduit for their exact meanings, even when those meanings were difficult or uncomfortable. The principle applied to their current investigation. David's role was to provide accurate intelligence, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be for Riku. The betrayals they were uncovering were personal and painful, involving people Riku had trusted and relied upon. But David's responsibility was to the accuracy of the information, not to Riku's emotional comfort. Park's motivations are becoming clearer, David reported after a week of focused observation. He's not just selling technical specifications. He's providing detailed analysis of your research and development priorities, explaining which projects are most likely to succeed and which represent the best investment opportunities for competitors. His insights are extremely valuable because he understands both the technical feasibility and the commercial potential of your innovations. That level of strategic analysis goes far beyond his official responsibilities, Riku noted. He's essentially functioning as an external consultant for our competitors, using inside knowledge to guide their investment decisions. Yuki's involvement is more concerning because of her access to your personal communications and strategic planning. She's been photographing confidential memos about merger discussions, board meeting agendas, and long-term strategic plans. This information would allow competitors to anticipate your moves and position themselves advantageously before you can implement new initiatives. The revelation about Yuki's betrayal was particularly devastating because it felt so personal. She had been present during his father's final months, had helped coordinate medical appointments and business continuity plans, had seemed genuinely grieved by Hiroshi's death. Her betrayal felt like a violation of family trust rather than simple corporate disloyalty. People rationalize betrayal in sophisticated ways, David observed, noting Riku's emotional reaction. Yuki probably tells herself that she's not really hurting you personally, that she's just sharing information that will eventually become public anyway. She's likely compartmentalized her actions so that she doesn't have to confront the full implications of what she's doing. How do you understand human psychology so well? Diplomatic work required reading people accurately across cultural and linguistic barriers. You learn to recognize the subtle signs of deception, rationalization, and internal conflict. More importantly, you learn that most people aren't fundamentally dishonest. They're just capable of convincing themselves that dishonest actions are justified under specific circumstances. David's insights into the psychology of betrayal were informed by his own experience with self-deception and rationalization. I spent years telling myself that my drinking was a reasonable response to professional stress, that my neglect of family responsibilities was temporary, that I would eventually get my priorities straight. People are remarkably creative at justifying behaviors they know are wrong. The coordinator of this conspiracy understands human psychology very well, Riku observed. They've identified each person's specific vulnerabilities and tailored their approach accordingly. Park's need for recognition, Yuki's financial desperation, Kim's professional ambition, each represents a different psychological entry point, which suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your organizational culture and individual employee histories. Someone who has had time to study your people and identify their weaknesses. The implications were troubling. The coordinator wasn't an outside agent, but someone within Tanaka Corporation who had used their position to map the psychological landscape of potential betrayers. Someone who understood the company's culture well enough to predict which employees might be susceptible to recruitment and what approaches would be most effective. "We need to identify the coordinator," Riku said. "Park, Yuki, and Kim are symptoms, not the disease itself," agreed. "But identifying the coordinator requires understanding their motivation. Corporate espionage for profit is one thing. Systematic destruction of your company suggests personal animosity rather than financial opportunity." David's analysis pointed towards someone with deep grievances against Tanaka Corporation or the Tanaka family specifically. Someone who felt wronged or overlooked. Someone who believed they deserved recognition or compensation they had never received. Someone whose personal vendetta had evolved into professional sabotage. "Your father made enemies during his career," David said. "Successful leaders always do. Business decisions that seemed reasonable at the time often create resentment that festers for years. Someone he passed over for promotion, someone he had to terminate, someone whose ideas he rejected. Any of those could have developed into the kind of personal animosity that would motivate this level of systematic revenge." The conversation forced Riku to confront uncomfortable truths about his father's legacy. Hiroshi had been widely respected and generally beloved, but no leader of a major corporation could maintain that reputation without making decisions that damaged other people's interests. Every promotion meant someone else was passed over. Every strategic shift meant some employees' skills became less valuable. Every cost-cutting measure meant some people lost their jobs. "My father wasn't perfect," Riku admitted. "He made difficult decisions, sometimes harsh decisions. But he tried to treat people fairly and with dignity." "Fair and dignified treatment doesn't eliminate resentment," David replied. "Sometimes it makes the resentment worse because people can't claim they were treated badly. When someone is terminated respectfully, with generous severance and genuine regret, they can't blame their failure on poor treatment. They have to confront the possibility that they simply weren't good enough, and that realization can create deeper anger than obvious unfairness would generate." The psychological complexity of their adversary was becoming clear. They were dealing with someone intelligent, patient, and deeply motivated by personal grievance. Someone who had spent years planning this systematic destruction, carefully recruiting accomplices, and positioning themselves to avoid detection while maximizing damage to the company. The tarnished diplomatic medal David kept hidden in his coat had once represented honor and achievement at the highest levels of international service. He showed it to Riku during one of their late-night conversations, the medal dulled by years of neglect but still recognizable as a symbol of distinguished service. "The State Department awarded this for my work during the Middle East peace negotiations in 2014, David said, turning the medal over in his palm. 15 languages, 6 months of continuous interpretation, successful resolution of conflicts that had been festering for decades. At the time, it felt like the pinnacle of my career. What does it represent to you now? Evidence that achievement and failure aren't mutually exclusive. I was simultaneously at the height of my professional success and the beginning of my personal collapse. The medal represents competence that couldn't prevent catastrophe, skills that couldn't protect the people who mattered most. Their investigation had reached a dangerous phase. David's Street Network had provided intelligence about an upcoming meeting between the conspiracy coordinator and external buyers. The meeting would take place in a private dining room at an upscale hotel, scheduled for the same evening as Tanaka Corporation's quarterly board meeting. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was designed to ensure that key executives would be occupied while sensitive negotiations took place. "We need evidence," Riku said. Speculation and pattern recognition aren't enough to expose this level of systematic betrayal. We need documentation, recordings, proof that will convince the board and satisfy law enforcement. Getting evidence means taking risks, David replied. I can observe the meeting, but I can't record it without sophisticated equipment and substantial preparation. More importantly, if I'm discovered, both of us become targets rather than investigators. The personal stakes were escalating alongside the professional ones. David had begun to emerge from the protective isolation he had maintained for years, and the process was both exhilarating and terrifying. Speaking regularly with Riku, contributing meaningful analysis to important problems, feeling useful again. These experiences were awakening parts of himself he had thought were permanently buried. I'm starting to remember who I used to be, David admitted during one of their conversations. Not the broken person who's been living on the streets, but the professional who could solve complex problems, who could make a difference in the world. It's dangerous to remember that person because it makes the contrast with my current situation more painful. Maybe the contrast isn't as stark as you think, Riku suggested. You're solving complex problems right now. You're making a difference. The context has changed, but your fundamental capabilities haven't disappeared. But this is temporary. When we solve this problem or fail to solve it, I go back to being invisible. You go back to your corporate responsibilities, and I go back to survival on the streets. This partnership exists only because of exceptional circumstances. Riku had been wrestling with similar questions about identity and purpose. His father's legacy cast a shadow over every decision he made, every relationship he maintained, every strategy he implemented. He was simultaneously Hiroshi's son and his own person, carrying expectations that sometimes felt impossible to fulfill. I used to think leadership meant having all the answers, Riku said. My father seemed to approach every situation with confidence and clarity. I assumed that confidence came naturally, that great leaders simply knew what to do instinctively. Working with you has taught me that real intelligence often comes from admitting what you don't know and seeking insights from unexpected sources. Your father was confident because he had developed systems for gathering information and testing his assumptions. Confidence without competence is dangerous, but competence without confidence is paralyzing. You're learning to balance both. David's observation about confidence and competence reflected his own internal struggle. His professional competence had never disappeared, but his confidence had been shattered by personal tragedy and subsequent failures. Working with Riku was gradually rebuilding his sense of self-worth, but that rebuilding process created new vulnerabilities and new fears about potential future losses. The conspiracy they were investigating had become more complex and more personal as they learned more about its scope and motivation. The coordinator wasn't just stealing trade secrets for financial gain. They were systematically destroying Tanaka Corporation's culture and reputation, targeting the company's relationships with employees, customers, and partners. This level of comprehensive attack requires someone with deep institutional knowledge and substantial resources, David observed. Someone who understands not just your business operations, but your organizational psychology, your corporate culture, your family history. Someone who knows exactly where to apply pressure to create maximum damage. Which means someone close to my family, possibly someone who worked directly with my father, Riku realized. Someone who feels betrayed by the company, despite receiving significant benefits and opportunities. The investigation had led them to a disturbing conclusion. Their adversary wasn't a stranger or an outside agent, but someone from within their own organizational family. Someone who had shared meals with Riku's father, who had attended company celebrations, who had been trusted with sensitive information and important responsibilities. Betrayal by strangers is just business, David said. Betrayal by family or close colleagues is personal. It creates deeper wounds, because it violates assumptions about trust and loyalty that form the foundation of any successful organization. How? Do we prepare for a confrontation with someone who knows us that well? Very carefully and with complete honesty about our own vulnerabilities. This person understands your weaknesses, your decision-making patterns, your emotional triggers. They'll use that knowledge to maintain their advantage and avoid exposure. David's diplomatic experience had taught him that the most dangerous negotiations were always with people who understood his background and methods. During international conflicts, the hardest adversaries to deal with were always the ones who had studied our negotiating history, who knew our cultural blind spots, who could predict our responses to various pressures. Anonymous enemies are much easier to handle than enemies who know exactly how you think. The realization that their adversary possessed intimate knowledge of Riku's psychology and decision-making patterns changed the nature of their strategic planning. They couldn't rely on conventional approaches because the coordinator would anticipate and counter those approaches. They needed tactics that would surprise someone who thought they knew everything about how Riku Tanaka would respond to crisis. "We need to do something completely unexpected," Riku said. "Something that goes against my established patterns. Something that violates the assumptions this person has made about how I handle problems." "What would be completely out of character for you?" "Trusting a homeless stranger with sensitive corporate intelligence," Riku replied with a slight smile. "Taking advice from someone outside my professional network. Acting on intuition rather than extensive analysis and committee consensus. Then we're already behaving in ways your adversary won't anticipate. The question is whether we can maintain that unpredictability long enough to expose their operations before they realize we've changed the rules of engagement." The family photograph sat on Riku's desk like an accusation waiting to be acknowledged. It showed his father, Hiroshi, at a corporate retreat in 2015, surrounded by senior executives and their families. Everyone was smiling, relaxed, celebrating another successful year for Tanaka Corporation. David stared at the image with an expression that combined recognition, surprise, and something that looked like betrayal. "I know him," David said quietly, pointing to a man standing directly behind Hiroshi. "Matsumoto Kenji, your father's former head of strategic development. I interpreted for him during the Seoul Economic Summit in 2016. We worked together for 2 weeks on complex trade negotiations involving renewable energy partnerships." Riku felt the world shift beneath him. "Matsumoto-san left the company in 2017. My father said he wanted to pursue independent consulting opportunities. That there were no hard feelings about his departure." "There were very hard feelings," David corrected, his voice heavy with new understanding. "During our work together, Matsumoto spoke extensively about his frustrations with Tanaka Corporation. He felt that your father was too conservative, too focused on gradual growth when aggressive expansion was necessary. He believed he should have been designated as Hiroshi's successor instead of you." The revelation hit Riku like a physical blow. Matsumoto had been more than a senior executive. He had been his father's protégé, the brilliant strategic mind who had developed many of the company's most successful market expansion plans. His departure had been presented as amicable, a mutual decision that benefited everyone involved. But David's account suggested a very different reality. "Matsumoto told me that he had developed comprehensive plans for international expansion that would have doubled the company's revenue within 5 years," David continued. "He said your father rejected those plans as too risky, too dependent on debt financing and aggressive market positioning. He felt that Hiroshi was letting fear of failure prevent the company from reaching its full potential." "My father never mentioned any conflict with Matsumoto," Riku said, though even as he spoke, he began remembering subtle signs he had overlooked at the time. The strained conversations, the formal politeness that had replaced earlier warmth, the carefully neutral references to Matsumoto's different vision for the company's future. Your father was protecting you from office politics that he thought you weren't ready to handle, David explained. Matsumoto was positioning himself as the alternative to family leadership, suggesting that professional management would be more effective than hereditary succession. Hiroshi managed the situation diplomatically, but Matsumoto left feeling that his contributions had been undervalued and his capabilities underutilized. The photograph took on sinister new meaning as Riku studied Matsumoto's expression. What he had remembered as a friendly smile now looked calculating, predatory. The man who had shared family meals and company celebrations had been quietly building resentment that would eventually evolve into systematic revenge. Matsumoto has the knowledge, access, and motivation to orchestrate everything we've discovered, David observed. He understands your corporate culture intimately, knows which employees might be vulnerable to recruitment, and has maintained enough contact with current staff to coordinate their activities. Most importantly, he has detailed knowledge of your family's decision-making patterns and emotional vulnerabilities. But he's been gone for 3 years. How could he maintain that level of operational control over current employees? Consulting relationships, David replied. Matsumoto probably maintained informal advisory relationships with key personnel, presenting himself as a mentor and strategic counselor. Park would have trusted his technical guidance. Yuki would have respected his connection to your father. Kim would have been flattered by attention from such a senior figure. None of them would have realized they were being recruited for a coordinated betrayal. The complexity of Matsumoto's revenge became clear as they examined the timeline of corporate intelligence theft. The systematic targeting had begun approximately 6 months after his departure, initially focusing on technical specifications and market research that could be sold to competitors for immediate profit. But the scope had gradually expanded to include strategic intelligence that seemed designed to undermine Tanaka Corporation's competitive position rather than simply generate revenue. This isn't just corporate espionage, Riku realized. This is personal destruction disguised as business competition. Matsumoto wants to prove that the company can't succeed without his leadership, that my father made a mistake by choosing family succession over professional management. The timing of the current escalation isn't coincidental, David added. Your father's death created an opportunity for Matsumoto to accelerate his revenge. With Hiroshi gone, there's no one left who fully understands Matsumoto's capabilities and motivations. You inherited the company, but not your father's complete knowledge of its internal politics and hidden conflicts. The revelation that their meeting hadn't been coincidental was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of David's recognition. Matsumoto knows about our partnership, David said with growing certainty. He's been monitoring your activities, probably through Yuki's access to your calendar and communications. He knows you've been meeting someone in the alley behind Sakura Fusion. How could he know it was you specifically? Because he arranged it, David replied, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. Matsumoto knew I would be in Seoul. He knew about my circumstances, my background, my connection to your father's 2018 conference. He engineered our meeting by ensuring that his recruitment operations would create visible patterns that someone with my analytical background would recognize and report. The scope of Matsumoto's manipulation was staggering. He had orchestrated not just the corporate espionage, but also David's involvement in exposing it, creating a scenario where Riku would be forced to trust an unreliable source and make decisions based on unverifiable intelligence. Every move they had made had been anticipated and incorporated into a larger strategy designed to discredit Riku's leadership and justify external intervention in Tanaka Corporation's management. We've been playing his game according to his rules, Riku said, the full implications becoming clear. He wanted us to discover the betrayals by Park, Yuki, and Kim because exposing them serves his larger purpose. Their removal eliminates witnesses to his coordination, while creating instability that justifies outside management. Worse than that, David replied grimly. He's been documenting our partnership, probably through surveillance and intelligence, gathered from Yuki's access to your personal communications. When the time comes, he'll reveal that you've been conducting corporate security investigations with a homeless vagrant, using unverified intelligence from an unreliable source to make important business decisions. The board will see that as evidence of poor judgment and leadership incompetence. The trap was elegant and comprehensive. Matsumoto had created a situation where every possible response would serve his objectives. If Riku ignored the evidence of betrayal, the corporate espionage would continue until the company collapsed. If Riku acted on the evidence, he would expose himself to criticism for relying on questionable sources and unorthodox methods. Either way, Matsumoto's narrative about the inadequacy of family leadership would be validated. "How long have you suspected?" Riku asked. "Part of me has known since I recognized him in the photograph," David admitted. "But I didn't want to believe it because it meant that everything we've done has been manipulated, that our partnership was manufactured rather than genuine. It meant that my usefulness to you was just another element of someone else's revenge plot." "Our partnership is genuine," Riku said firmly. "Matsumoto may have arranged our meeting, but he couldn't manufacture the trust we've developed or the Biryandi core, the insights we've shared. He counted on us being adversaries or at least remaining strangers. He didn't anticipate that we might become allies." The realization that Matsumoto had underestimated their relationship provided the first hint of strategic advantage they had discovered. The revenge plot depended on Riku remaining isolated and David remaining invisible. Their growing friendship and mutual respect represented variables that Matsumoto hadn't fully accounted for in his planning. "If we're going to expose him," David said, "we need evidence that connects him directly to the coordination of betrayals. Park, Yuki, and Kim probably don't even know his real identity or objectives. They've been manipulated as skillfully as we have, and we need to do it in a way that doesn't validate his criticisms of my leadership," Riku added. "Simply accusing him without proof will look like desperate scapegoating. We need documentation, recordings, evidence that will convince the board and protect the company from future manipulation." The stakes had escalated beyond corporate survival to personal vindication. Both men were fighting not just for Tanaka Corporation, but for their own dignity and self-respect. Matsumoto's revenge plot had targeted their deepest vulnerabilities: Riku's insecurity about living up to his father's legacy, David's guilt about his fall from professional respectability. Exposing the conspiracy would require confronting those vulnerabilities directly and finding strength they weren't certain they possessed. Riku's father's last letter had been sealed and placed in the company safe with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of a major crisis threatening the corporation's survival. The letter, written in Hiroshi's careful handwriting, had been translated into English years earlier by David during one of their diplomatic consultations, though David had been sworn to confidentiality about its contents at the time. "Your father knew this was coming," David said as they sat in Riku's office after hours. The letter spread between them like a map to understanding. Not the specific details, but the general pattern. He suspected that Matsumoto's departure hadn't resolved their fundamental disagreements about the company's future direction. The letter, written in formal Japanese with occasional phrases in English, revealed Hiroshi's concerns about potential internal threats to family leadership. He had identified several employees who possessed both the capability and possible motivation to undermine the company from within, with Matsumoto heading the list of potential adversaries. Most tellingly, he had included specific warnings about trusting intelligence from unexpected sources and the importance of verifying information through multiple channels before taking action. He anticipated that Matsumoto might try to manipulate you through false intelligence or manufactured crises, David explained, translating nuances that weren't captured in the original English version. This section warns about advisors who appear helpful but actually serve hidden agendas, about information that seems valuable but actually serves someone else's strategic objectives. Riku felt a mixture of gratitude and grief as he absorbed his father's prescient warnings. Hiroshi had tried to prepare him for challenges he couldn't specifically predict, providing general principles for handling complex betrayals and sophisticated deceptions. The letter was both practical advice and emotional support from beyond the grave, a final gift from a father who had understood his son's vulnerabilities and tried to provide protection. But he also warns against paralysis through excessive suspicion, David continued. He says that leadership requires taking calculated risks based on imperfect information. That waiting for complete certainty often means missing opportunities to address problems before they become crises. The balance between caution and action had become the central challenge of their situation. They possessed strong circumstantial evidence of Matsumoto's coordination of the conspiracy, but circumstantial evidence wouldn't be sufficient to convince the board or satisfy legal requirements. For prosecution, they needed direct proof of his involvement, recorded conversations, or documented communications that would establish his culpability beyond reasonable doubt. The quarterly board meeting is tomorrow night, Riku observed. Matsumoto will expect the conspiracy to reach its culmination during or immediately after that meeting. If Park, Yuki, and Kim provide their final intelligence deliveries on schedule, he'll have everything necessary to present a comprehensive case for external management intervention, which means tonight is our last opportunity to gather evidence. David replied, after tomorrow, either we've exposed the conspiracy or we've become its final victims. The plan they developed was dangerous and uncertain, requiring David to return to a world of professional interaction he had abandoned years earlier. They would arrange a controlled meeting with Matsumoto, ostensibly to negotiate David's consulting services for intelligence about Tanaka Corporation's vulnerabilities. The meeting would be recorded using sophisticated audio equipment that Riku could access through corporate security resources. The psychological challenge will be enormous, David admitted as they refined their strategy. I haven't conducted professional negotiations in 8 years. I haven't worn decent clothes, maintained formal conversation, or presented myself as a competent professional since my collapse. Matsumoto will be looking for signs of instability or incompetence that he can exploit. You've been conducting professional negotiations with me for weeks, Riku pointed out. Your analytical capabilities and strategic insights are sharp as ever. The context will be different, but your fundamental competence hasn't disappeared. David's fear of professional reintegration was understandable, but possibly overstated. His work with Riku had demonstrated that his diplomatic skills remained intact despite his circumstances. He could read people accurately, analyze complex situations effectively, and communicate insights with clarity and precision. The homeless vagrant persona he had maintained for survival might actually provide advantages in dealing with Matsumoto, who would likely underestimate his capabilities based on his appearance. Matsumoto will expect me to be desperate, grateful for any opportunity to return to professional relevance, David said. He'll assume that I can be bought cheaply and controlled easily because of my personal vulnerabilities. Those assumptions might give us the opening we need to record his direct admission of the conspiracy. The risk is enormous for both of us, Riku acknowledged. If Matsumoto realizes we're working together to expose him, he'll accelerate his timeline and probably destroy evidence before we can gather enough proof. If the recording fails or doesn't capture sufficient detail, we'll have revealed our knowledge without gaining the evidence we need for prosecution. The stakes extended beyond corporate survival to personal redemption for both men. David was risking his carefully maintained invisibility exposing himself to scrutiny and potential retaliation in exchange for the possibility of professional vindication. Riku was risking his family's legacy and his own future, betting everything on intelligence gathered from a source the board would consider highly questionable. Your father's letter includes advice about handling situations where personal and professional obligations conflict, David noted, reading from one of the final paragraphs. He says that integrity sometimes requires accepting personal costs to protect larger interests, that leadership means making decisions based on what's right rather than what's safe. The observation resonated with their current dilemma. The safe approach would be to present their suspicions to the board without direct evidence, accepting that Matsumoto's conspiracy might succeed, but avoiding the risks of a direct confrontation. The right approach required taking personal risks to gather evidence that could protect the company and expose the truth about the systematic betrayals. He also warns about the danger of becoming so focused on external threats that you neglect internal renewal, David continued. This section discusses the importance of building trust with unexpected allies and learning from people whose perspectives differ from conventional wisdom. Riku realized that his father had not only anticipated the specific threat from Matsumoto, but had also provided guidance for the exact solution they were pursuing. The letter validated their partnership and encouraged the unorthodox approach they were taking to expose the conspiracy. Hiroshi had understood that conventional corporate security measures would be insufficient against sophisticated internal threats, that creative solutions would require creative alliances. Tomorrow night, during the board meeting, Matsumoto will probably be finalizing arrangements for the hostile takeover or management transition he's been orchestrating, Riku said. He'll be confident that his 3-year campaign has created sufficient instability to justify external intervention, and we'll be presenting evidence that reframes that entire narrative, David added, instead of a struggling company that needs new management. The board will see a successful company that has been systematically sabotaged by a disgruntled former executive seeking personal revenge. The final preparations required careful coordination of timing, technology, and psychology. David would need to transform himself back into a presentable professional, a process that involved not just clothing and grooming but mental preparation for returning to a world he had abandoned. Riku would need to maintain normal business operations while secretly preparing for a confrontation that could determine the company's future. Whatever happens tomorrow, Riku said as they concluded their planning session, I want you to know that working with you has changed my understanding of leadership and intelligence. You've taught me that the most valuable insights often come from the most unexpected sources. That competence and social status aren't the same thing. That real wisdom often develops through adversity rather than success. And you've reminded me that my skills and experience still have value, David replied. That professional collapse doesn't erase fundamental capabilities. That redemption is possible, even after catastrophic failure. Tomorrow night, we'll both be risking everything we've built together. But we'll be doing it as partners, rather than as the isolated individuals we were when this started. The small audio recording device, no larger than a shirt button, represented David's return to the world of professional espionage and diplomatic intelligence gathering. Hidden beneath his lapel, it would capture every word of his confrontation with Matsumoto while remaining virtually invisible to casual observation. The technology was sophisticated enough to filter background noise and enhance voice clarity, ensuring that any confession would be legally admissible as evidence. David had transformed himself for the meeting with meticulous attention to detail. The clothes, a well-tailored suit borrowed from Riku's wardrobe and altered to fit, gave him the appearance of professional respectability he had abandoned years earlier. His hair had been cut and styled, his face cleanly shaved, his overall presentation restored to diplomatic standards. The transformation was remarkable, revealing the distinguished professional who had been hidden beneath layers of neglect and survival necessities. You look like the person in the conference photographs, Riku observed as David made final adjustments to his appearance. The change is so complete that I almost don't recognize you as the man I met in the alley. Appearance is just costume, David replied, though his voice carried notes of uncertainty. The real test will be whether I can remember how to conduct high-stakes negotiations without the protective invisibility I've maintained for 8 years. The meeting was scheduled for 8 p.m. at the hotel bar where Matsumoto regularly conducted confidential business discussions. The location provided public visibility that would discourage overt threats, while offering sufficient privacy for sensitive conversations. David would present himself as a freelance intelligence consultant with valuable information about Tanaka Corporation's internal vulnerabilities, suggesting that his insider knowledge might be useful for Matsumoto's continuing efforts to destabilize the company. Remember that Matsumoto believes he's been manipulating both of us successfully for months, Riku said as they reviewed their strategy one final time. He'll be confident that he understands your motivations and my weaknesses. That overconfidence should make him careless about what he reveals during your conversation. David nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, the first tie he had worn in nearly a decade. Diplomatic negotiations taught me that the most dangerous moment is always when your opponent believes they hold all the advantages. Overconfident adversaries often reveal information they would normally protect because they don't believe their opponent poses a real threat. The psychology of the confrontation would be complex and multi-layered. Matsumoto would expect David to be desperate for validation and employment, vulnerable to manipulation through offers of professional rehabilitation. He would assume that years of homelessness had broken David's spirit and compromised his analytical abilities. Those assumptions would create opportunities for David to gather information while appearing to be a willing collaborator. The key is to let him believe he's recruiting me rather than interrogating me, David explained as they walked toward the hotel. I need to appear eager to please, grateful for his attention, willing to provide information in exchange for promises of future cooperation. If I seem too sophisticated or too knowledgeable, he'll become suspicious. Can you maintain that deception convincingly? I spent 15 years managing diplomatic negotiations where everyone was lying about their true positions and objectives, David replied. Professional deception isn't about creating false personas. It's about selectively revealing authentic aspects of yourself while concealing information that might disadvantage your position. The hotel bar was elegant and discreet, the kind of establishment where powerful people conducted sensitive business without attracting unwanted attention. David arrived precisely on time, his appearance now so professional that the staff treated him with the deference reserved for important guests. He ordered a single malt whiskey, partly to calm his nerves, partly to complete his transformation back into the world of adult professional relationships. Matsumoto appeared at 8:15, fashionably late in the manner of someone accustomed to having others wait for his convenience. His appearance was immaculate and expensive, his manner confident and slightly condescending. He studied David with obvious surprise, clearly not expecting the homeless vagrant to have cleaned up so convincingly. Mr. Mercer, Matsumoto said, extending his hand with practiced professional courtesy. You look quite different than I expected based on recent reports about your circumstances. Circumstances change, David replied, accepting the handshake with firm confidence. Professional competence tends to be more durable than personal stability. I appreciate your willingness to meet with someone whose recent history might seem unpromising. Matsumoto ordered an expensive Japanese whiskey and settled into his chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. Your message was intriguing but vague. You mentioned having insights about Tanaka Corporation that might be valuable to my consulting work. I'm curious about what you might know and how you came to know it. Living on the streets provides unique opportunities for observation, David began, allowing a note of bitterness to color his voice. Corporate executives assume that homeless people are invisible or irrelevant. They discuss sensitive matters within earshot of people they don't consider capable of understanding or acting on the information they overhear. Fascinating. And what exactly have you overheard that might interest me? David leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to suggest confidential disclosure. Riku Tanaka has been struggling with systematic intelligence leaks for months. Someone with high-level access has been providing competitors with proprietary information, trade secrets, strategic plans. The leaks are sophisticated and coordinated, suggesting professional organization rather than opportunistic theft. Matsumoto's expression remained neutral, but David caught a flicker of interest in his eyes. That would certainly explain some of the challenges Tanaka Corporation has been experiencing lately. Do you have any insights about who might be responsible for these leaks? Several people, actually. Employees with various motivations and access levels, each contributing different types of intelligence. But the coordination suggests someone with comprehensive understanding of the company's operations and culture. Someone who knows which employees might be vulnerable to recruitment and what approaches would be most effective. Matsumoto sipped his whiskey thoughtfully, maintaining careful neutrality. You seem to have developed quite detailed insights during your time on the streets. Have you shared these observations with Riku Tanaka directly? We've had several conversations, David admitted, allowing uncertainty to creep into his voice. He's been receptive to my information, though obviously skeptical about my reliability as a source. A homeless vagrant isn't exactly the kind of consultant most CEOs would choose to trust with corporate intelligence matters. Indeed. And what has been his response to your insights about these systematic leaks? David hesitated deliberately, as if uncertain about revealing confidential information. He's been investigating quietly, trying to identify the individuals involved without causing organizational disruption. But he's approaching it as isolated incidents rather than coordinated conspiracy. I don't think he understands the sophisticated nature of what he's dealing with. Sophisticated in what way? The psychological manipulation is extremely skillful, David replied, warming to his subject. Whoever is coordinating this operation understands exactly how to identify potential collaborators and exactly what approaches will be most effective with each individual. Technical experts who feel undervalued, administrative staff facing financial pressures, ambitious professionals seeking advancement opportunities. Each represents a different entry point that requires different manipulation strategies. Matsumoto leaned back slightly, his expression revealing the first hints of genuine interest. You speak as if you have professional experience with this type of psychological analysis. Diplomatic interpretation requires reading people accurately across cultural and linguistic barriers, David explained. You learn to recognize the signs of internal conflict, rationalization, and potential susceptibility to external influence. Most people aren't fundamentally dishonest. They just need help convincing themselves that dishonest actions are justified under specific circumstances. A useful skill set, Matsumoto observed, and one that might have commercial applications in the right context. The opening David had been waiting for. I've been hoping to find opportunities to apply my analytical abilities in a more structured way than random street observations. Working with someone who understands both corporate dynamics and strategic intelligence could be mutually beneficial. What exactly are you proposing? Consultation services, David replied carefully. I could provide detailed analysis of Tanaka Corporation's internal vulnerabilities, psychological profiles of key personnel, assessment of which employees might be susceptible to various forms of influence or recruitment. My unique position has given me insights that would be difficult to gather through conventional intelligence methods. Matsumoto's smile was cold and calculating. And in exchange for these insights, what would you expect as compensation? Professional rehabilitation, David said, allowing desperation to show in his voice. A chance to prove that my skills still have value, that my personal failures haven't destroyed my fundamental capabilities. Money is secondary to the opportunity to feel useful again. The desperation was genuine, though not in the way Matsumoto interpreted it. David was desperate to succeed in this deception, desperate to gather the evidence that would expose the conspiracy and protect both Riku and Tanaka Corporation from systematic destruction. Matsumoto studied David for several long moments, clearly evaluating the potential risks and benefits of collaboration. "Your proposal has merit," he finally said. "Though, I would need to understand the full scope of your intelligence capabilities before committing to any formal arrangement." "What would you like to know?" "Start with specifics about the employees you believe are involved in intelligence leaks. Names, positions, motivations, methods of communication. If your analysis is as comprehensive as you suggest, you should be able to provide detailed operational intelligence." David took a careful sip of his whiskey, using the pause to activate the recording device with a subtle gesture. Park Min-jun from Research and Development has been providing technical specifications to external parties. His motivation is professional recognition. He feels his contributions to the company's renewable energy patents haven't been properly acknowledged. Yuki Sato from Executive Administration has been photographing confidential documents and strategic communications. Her motivation is financial desperation related to her mother's medical expenses. Kim Sung-ho from Legal Affairs has been building documentation for what appears to be a comprehensive lawsuit against the company. "Impressive detail," Matsumoto said, though his tone remained neutral. "How did you gather such specific information?" "Patient observation and linguistic advantages," David replied. "People discuss sensitive matters more freely when they believe their audience can understand or doesn't matter. Korean, Japanese, English. I understand conversations that participants assume are private or secure." The corporate seal of Tanaka Corporation, embossed in gold on the legal documents spread across the conference table, would soon validate the most important testimony in the company's history. Matsumoto had grown increasingly comfortable during their conversation, his confidence overriding his natural caution as David continued to provide detailed intelligence that confirmed his successful manipulation of the corporate conspiracy. "Your analysis of the three primary assets is remarkably accurate," Matsumoto said, using language that revealed his operational mindset. "Though I'm curious about your assessment of the coordination mechanisms. You mentioned sophisticated psychological manipulation. What makes you believe these individuals are being managed rather than acting independently?" David leaned forward, allowing enthusiasm to show in his voice. "The timing is too precise to be coincidental. Park's delivery of technical specifications always precedes Yuki's provision of strategic documents by exactly 48 hours. Kim's legal documentation activities spike immediately after major board meetings or policy announcements. Someone is coordinating their activities to maximize intelligence value while minimizing detection risks. Sophisticated operational planning." Matsumoto agreed, his tone carrying notes of professional pride. "The kind of coordination that requires comprehensive understanding of corporate culture, employee psychology, and strategic timing. Exactly the kind of coordination that a former senior executive might provide," David said, watching Matsumoto's reaction carefully. "Someone with intimate knowledge of the company's decision-making processes, access to employee psychological profiles, and sufficient credibility to maintain advisory relationships with current staff." Matsumoto's smile became more genuine, the expression of someone who appreciated having his professional competence recognized. Theoretical coordination of that sophistication would indeed require someone with substantial institutional knowledge and strategic planning capabilities. Would you be able to provide that level of coordination? David asked directly. Hypothetically? Matsumoto's voice carried clear amusement. Hypothetically, someone with my background and relationships could certainly design and implement a comprehensive intelligence operation targeting Tanaka Corporation. The psychological entry points are obvious if you understand the corporate culture. Park's need for recognition, Yuki's financial desperation, Kim's professional ambitions. Each represents a clear vulnerability that could be exploited through appropriate approaches. And the strategic objective would be comprehensive destabilization. Leading to management transition, Matsumoto replied without hesitation. Systematic erosion of competitive advantages, gradual undermining of board confidence in current leadership, creation of crisis conditions that justify external intervention. The family leadership model is obsolete in modern corporate environments. Professional management would be far more effective. David felt a surge of satisfaction as Matsumoto continued to incriminate himself with increasing specificity. The recording device was capturing every word of what amounted to a detailed confession of corporate sabotage and conspiracy to commit fraud. How long would such a theoretical operation require to achieve its objectives? David pressed. 3 to 4 years for complete success, Matsumoto replied confidently. Gradual escalation prevents detection, while building cumulative pressure, it eventually becomes overwhelming. The current timeline suggests we're approaching the culmination phase, where accumulated damage becomes impossible for current management to address effectively. We're approaching? Matsumoto caught his slip but seemed unconcerned about the implications. A theoretical timeline, of course. Though, I admit I've been following Tanaka Corporation's struggles with considerable professional interest. Riku has proven even less competent than I anticipated when I left the company. His father's death accelerated the organizational decline significantly. You knew Hiroshi Tanaka personally? I was his senior strategic advisor for over a decade, Matsumoto said, his voice carrying bitterness that had been carefully controlled. Until now, I developed most of the market expansion plans that built the company's current position. I identified the growth opportunities that generated billions in revenue. I provided the strategic vision that Hiroshi was too conservative to implement fully. But he chose his son as successor instead of you. Family sentiment over professional competence, Matsumoto replied, his composure finally cracking to reveal. Years of accumulated resentment. Riku inherited a position he was never qualified to hold, supported by a board that deferred to family tradition rather than strategic necessity. The company's recent struggles prove that nepotism is no substitute for genuine leadership capability. David recognized the moment of maximum vulnerability and pressed his advantage. So the systematic intelligence leaks, the coordinated employee betrayals, the strategic sabotage, all of that represents your response to being passed over for succession. It represents professional intervention to prevent continued organizational decline, Matsumoto corrected, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as David. Riku's failures were destroying everything Hiroshi built. External management represents the only viable solution for preserving the company's long-term viability. External management that you would provide? I have comprehensive plans for restructuring operations, eliminating inefficiencies, and restoring competitive advantages, Matsumoto said, his voice gaining strength as he outlined his vision. The intelligence gathered over the past 3 years has identified every weakness in current management, every opportunity for improvement, every strategic modification necessary for renewed success. Intelligence you coordinated through Park, Yuki, and Kim. Intelligence they provided willingly in exchange for appropriate compensation and professional guidance. Matsumoto replied, none of them were coerced. Each understood they were contributing to organizational improvement rather than destruction. Did they understand they were participating in a conspiracy to overthrow family leadership? Matsumoto paused, finally recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond theoretical discussion to specific admission of illegal activities. I think this conversation has become more detailed than appropriate for a preliminary consultation. On the contrary, David said, his voice dropping to the authoritative tone he had used during diplomatic negotiations. This conversation has provided exactly the information I came here to gather. What do you mean? I mean that every word you've spoken has been recorded and will be presented to the Tanaka Corporation Board of Directors as evidence of corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, and systematic betrayal of fiduciary responsibilities. David removed the recording device from his lapel and placed it on the table between them. Matsumoto's face went white as the full implications became clear. You're working for Riku. I'm working with Riku, David corrected. As partners committed to protecting his father's legacy from someone who confused professional disappointment with strategic vision. No one will believe testimony from a homeless vagrant, Matsumoto said, though his voice lacked conviction. They'll believe comprehensive evidence of systematic corporate sabotage presented by a former senior diplomatic interpreter whose credentials and background can be thoroughly verified, David replied. Your mistake was assuming that personal failure eliminates professional competence. My circumstances changed, but my capabilities remained intact. Matsumoto stood abruptly, his composure completely shattered. This recording was obtained through deception. It won't be admissible in court. It will be admissible in board proceedings and sufficient for civil litigation, David replied calmly. More importantly, it provides the foundation for criminal investigation of corporate espionage and conspiracy charges that carry substantial penalties. You have no idea what you've done, Matsumoto said, his voice carrying threats he was no longer in a position to implement. This company was failing under Riku's leadership. I was trying to save it. You were trying to steal it, David corrected. There's a significant difference between salvation and theft. The shared meal receipt from Hanami restaurant lay folded in David's wallet, a simple piece of paper that represented the complete transformation of two men's relationship. 6 months after exposing Matsumoto's conspiracy, David and Riku sat across from each other at the same table where they had celebrated their victory. But now their conversation focused on the future rather than the past. The board approved your permanent appointment as special security consultant, Riku said, sliding a formal contract across the table. Full benefits, competitive salary, office space in the executive wing if you want it. You've earned recognition for everything you contributed to saving the company. David studied the contract with appreciation but didn't immediately sign it. I'm grateful for the offer, but I'm not certain that returning to corporate life is the right path for me. I've discovered that my most valuable contributions come from maintaining perspectives that traditional corporate environments tend to discourage. What do you mean? I mean that my effectiveness in identifying the conspiracy came partly from my outsider status, from seeing patterns and relationships that insiders couldn't recognize because they were too close to the situation. Moving back inside the system might compromise the very advantages that made me useful. Riku nodded thoughtfully. So what are you proposing? Independent consulting with multiple clients, focusing on organizational psychology and security analysis. I want to help other companies identify internal threats and cultural vulnerabilities before they become crises. My unique background diplomatic experience combined with street-level observation provides insights that traditional security consultants might miss. David had spent the months since Matsumoto's exposure rebuilding his professional life carefully and deliberately. He had moved into a small but comfortable apartment, restored his health and appearance, and begun developing a client base among companies that valued unconventional approaches to organizational analysis. But he had resisted offers that would return him to traditional corporate hierarchies or diplomatic positions. I've learned that my greatest strength is the ability to see systems from multiple perspectives simultaneously. David continued. The homeless vagrant sees things that the executive consultant misses. The diplomatic interpreter understands cultural nuances that the security analyst might overlook. I want to maintain that psychological flexibility rather than allowing a single professional identity to limit my analytical capabilities. And you've been helping people in similar situations to your own? Every Tuesday and Thursday evening. David confirmed. I've been running workshops for homeless individuals who possess professional skills that might be marketable if properly supported. Language abilities, technical knowledge, analytical capabilities, the streets are filled with. Competent people who lost their social positioning through personal crises, but retained their fundamental abilities. The community outreach work had become David's most personally meaningful activity. He understood the psychological challenges of rebuilding professional identity after catastrophic failure, and he possessed both the credibility and insight necessary to help others navigate that complex process. His own recovery provided a model for what was possible, while his continued connection to street communities ensured that his assistance remained grounded in realistic understanding. How many people have you been able to help find employment? 17. So far, with 12 more in various stages of preparation. The key insight is that most homeless individuals didn't lose their skills. They lost their confidence and social connections. Providing both technical support and psychological encouragement can be remarkably effective. Riku was impressed but not surprised. David's analytical abilities had been evident from their first conversation, but his capacity for leadership and mentorship had emerged gradually as their partnership developed. Your father would have been proud of this work. Perhaps. He always believed that wasted human potential was both morally wrong and economically inefficient. He used to say that society's willingness to abandon competent people represented a form of collective stupidity that ultimately weakened everyone. He was right about that, as he was about many things. Tanaka Corporation had recovered strongly from the conspiracy's exposure. The board's confidence in Riku's leadership had been completely restored once they understood the sophisticated nature of the threats he had been addressing. Stock prices had rebounded as investors recognized that the company's previous struggles reflected external sabotage rather than management incompetence. Most importantly, the experience had taught Riku to value diverse perspectives and unconventional sources of insight. I've been implementing your suggestions about employee engagement and psychological assessment, Riku reported. Regular consultation, sessions with staff members, more comprehensive evaluation of personal pressures that might create vulnerabilities, better integration between technical competence and career advancement opportunities. Park, incidentally, has become one of our most effective team leaders since receiving proper recognition for his contributions. And Yuki? Promoted to Senior Administrative Coordinator with salary adjustments that reflect her actual responsibilities. Her mother's medical treatments are now covered under expanded company health benefits. She's become one of the most loyal and effective employees we have. People usually live up to the expectations you set for them, David observed. Treat them as potential betrayers, and some will fulfill that expectation. Treat them as valued contributors, and most will justify your confidence. The conversation was interrupted by a young woman who approached their table hesitantly. Excuse me, are you David Mercer? David looked up with polite interest. Yes, how can I help you? My name is Sarah Kim. I attended one of your workshops last month. I wanted to thank you. I just started a new job as a technical translator for an international consulting firm. Your advice about rebuilding professional confidence made all the difference. David's smile was genuine and warm. Congratulations, Sarah. What languages are you working with? Korean, English, and Mandarin. The company specializes in renewable energy projects. So my engineering background from before before I lost my apartment and couldn't maintain employment. That background is actually valuable again. After Sarah left to return to her table, Riku observed, "You found your calling." "I found a way to contribute that feels meaningful and sustainable," David agreed. "For the first time in 8 years, I wake up looking forward to the days. Work rather than simply trying to survive until evening." "Any regrets about turning down the corporate position?" "None. I spent 15 years in traditional professional roles, and while they provided financial security and social status, they didn't provide the sense of purpose I've discovered through helping other people rebuild their lives. This work feels more authentic to who I've become through adversity." David's transformation had been profound but gradual. The confident professional who had emerged from their conspiracy investigation possessed all of his original analytical capabilities, enhanced by insights that could only have been gained through genuine hardship and recovery. He understood both success and failure from direct experience, making him uniquely qualified to help others navigate complex transitions between different life circumstances. What about personal relationships? Dating? Family? The possibility of rebuilding those aspects of your life? "I'm open to possibilities," David replied carefully, "but I'm not actively seeking to recreate what I lost." Sarah and Emma were unique people, not interchangeable roles to be filled by similar individuals. "I'm learning to build a different kind of life that honors their memory while remaining open to new forms of connection and meaning." The grief had evolved from crushing weight to manageable presence, integrated into David's identity rather than dominating it. He would always carry the loss of his family, but he had learned to carry it as part of his strength rather than his weakness, as motivation for helping others rather than justification for self-destruction. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Riku reflected on how much both their lives had changed through their unlikely partnership. "I never thanked you properly for teaching me what leadership actually requires. Not just analytical intelligence or strategic planning, but the wisdom to recognize valuable insights regardless of their source, the courage to act on incomplete information, and the humility to accept help from unexpected allies. And you taught me that professional competence doesn't disappear through personal failure, that recovery is possible even after catastrophic loss, and that helping others often helps yourself in ways you couldn't anticipate," David replied. "Our partnership succeeded because neither of us tried to rescue the other. We simply offered what we had and accepted what was offered in return." Outside the restaurant, the Seoul business district bustled with the same energy and ambition that had characterized it during David's homeless years. But now he moved through those streets as a participant rather than an observer, as someone whose insights were valued rather than someone whose presence was barely acknowledged. The city hadn't changed, but his relationship to it had been completely transformed. "Same time next month?" Riku asked as they prepared to part ways. "Same time next month," David confirmed. "Though next time, dinner is on me. I finally have business cards again,